Hotel quarantine from April the 19th. The travel bubble had first been floated a year ago. New Zealanders have been free to travel to most parts of Australia without having to quarantine since October. Those arrangements have been suspended a number of times because of outbreaks in New Zealand. The former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull says the New South Wales government has given in to a ferocious campaign against him after his appointment to a climate advisory body was overturned. He was tapped to lead the Net Zero Emissions and Clean Economy Board, but the State Environment Minister Matt Keane today released a statement saying Mr Turnbull could distract from the board's goals. Western Australia's Health Minister is calling for an urgent review after the death of a 7-year-old girl at the Perth Children's Hospital. A spokesperson for the child's family says she began feeling feverish on Friday and her parents took her to the hospital's emergency department on Saturday afternoon, where she waited 2 hours before she was attended to. Her case was declared a code blue and she died that evening. And there are serious concerns about the spread of COVID-19 in Timor-Leste, with devastating floods forcing thousands of residents into temporary accommodation. At least 27 people have died and many more remain unaccounted for after the weekend's flash floods. Coronavirus case numbers have also been surging and the capital Dili had been in lockdown to try to limit community transmission. So at least 100 people have been killed and thousands are missing after flash floods and landslides in eastern Indonesia and neighbouring Timor-Leste. So in Timor-Leste, officials fear the crisis could cause a surge in COVID-19 cases, with people forced into crowded emergency shelters. Annie Sloman is Oxfam's Associate Country Director for Timor-Leste. She says the compounding effects of the floods and pandemic are serious.
We've currently got 11 evacuation centres that have over 7,000 people in them. We also are just about to undertake an assessment at a community level across the whole of Dili to assess how many people have actually been affected so that we can respond to their needs. And this is being led by the government, and development actors such as Oxfam, the Australian Humanitarian Partnership and others are taking part to coordinate this. In addition, we have people affected also in the municipality areas. In Okusi, there were big rains, the enclave in East Timor, yesterday, and we've been supporting 47 households there that have had their houses damaged. So we're talking really big impacts here across the whole of the country. So the big rains have, wettened things. We've had trees falling down, bridges broken. Communication has been also impacted. And on top of that, we've got a COVID situation. We've been in lockdown for the last month. And already during that month, people's food supplies were very low and we were doing emergency response food supplies. So this, in addition to what's happening, just means that people are extremely vulnerable and it's a really serious situation. So far, we've been supporting with evacuating people from the areas to the evacuation camps and supporting the evacuation camps. So doing assessments, providing food, materials. Today we're going to be doing the assessment of communities, and we'll be starting to roll out food and materials for communities. So trying to really get people back into their homes for those that can be, and when it's possible to actually start supporting rebuilding of homes that have been damaged.
The Minneapolis police chief has testified that former officer Derek Chauvin violated department policy, ethics and values when he continued to pin George Floyd to the ground after he'd stopped resisting. Medario Arredondo, the city's first black chief, told court he was alarmed when he first saw a bystander's video of the officer kneeling on the neck of Mr Floyd for more than 9 minutes. He said Derek Chauvin, who is facing murder and manslaughter charges, did not follow police training.
Once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped.
The defence argues the officer did what he was trained to do and says George Floyd died because of his use of illegal drugs and underlying health conditions. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a law that will potentially allow him to hold on to power until the year 2036. The constitutional change endorsed last year resets Mr Putin's previous term limits, allowing him to run for 2 more terms in office. The 68-year-old president has been in power for more than 2 decades, longer than any other Kremlin leader since Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who ruled for 29 years. Mr Putin's most prominent critic, Alexei Navalny, was arrested in January and is serving a 3.5-year jail sentence. Russian officials have released video purportedly showing Mr Navalny walking around and looking well, but the opposition leader says he is sick and being denied treatment. Australians already work some of the longest hours in the developed world, and the recent necessity of working from home has meant many people are still answering emails and texts well into the evening. Now, staff from Victoria Police have negotiated a clause in their workplace agreement that means they can't be contacted by work outside official hours. It's called the right to disconnect. Professor Emmanuel Josserand is from the Centre for Business and Social Innovation at UTS. He says the arrangement is necessary now that the boundaries between work and home are blurred.
People were working from home, so they were contactable from home, which create pressure and can blurry the boundary, the private life and work life boundary. Even in the case of the Victorian Police, the staff can still be contacted for emergency, or if, for instance, there was a need to check for their well-being. And for workers such as the Victorian Police who can be exposed to extreme stress during their work, I think that's very important to preserve their time to regenerate and come back to work. Now, in other cases, I mean, when talking about the topic to journalists, say, oh, yeah, but we receive email all the time. We exchange emails all the time. So the boundary might be what is acceptable and practical and makes sense in terms of private life and work can be a bit different. But if your producer starts contacting you at any time of day and night during your sleep, then obviously that's not acceptable. So that's why the French legislation, the Irish legislation that's been passed a few days back is really about finding what's right for a specific workplace or a specific profession or a specific industry, because it can't be a rule that fits all. Most of the legislation that have been adopted around the world are quite similar in the sense that they create an obligation to discuss the matter, but leave open to what the appropriate regulation should be with a specific profession or in a specific job, because it varies broadly across jobs, industries, and professions. What's important, whatever the level of regulation, is that the question is asked and that there is a dialogue, there is a discussion around what is okay or not. And if one employee for some reason has been pushed beyond the limit of what it's okay, it's important that there is a possibility to go to court with a strong principle around what's okay or not.
Queensland is facing another spell of wet weather causing hazardous surf and flash flooding on the Sunshine Coast. Michael Rennie has more from Brisbane.
I'm in Brisbane's Botanical Gardens in the CBD, where the rain is continuing to fall. It's been this consistent ongoing rain for the last couple of days, but not those really, really heavy falls which were predicted by the Bureau of Meteorology. And that's because the weather system that would have brought those heavy rains of up to 250 millimetres in some locations, that weather system has stayed off the Queensland coast and it hasn't crossed. So that means we have seen some good totals still, though, in places like the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast, falls of up to 150 millimetres in some areas. At Mount Glorious, that's where we've seen the biggest falls, 163 millimetres in the last 24 hours. There's weather warnings still along the Queensland coast also. There's a wind warning. We're expecting to see winds of up to 30 knots, and a surf warning as well, stretching all the way from the Fraser Coast down to the New South Wales-Queensland border. So many beaches expected to be closed today. In terms of where this rain has fallen, well, some of it has fallen into the dam catchments, but we haven't seen big totals around the Wivenhoe Dam, which currently sits around the 37% full mark. And overall, the water grid is sitting at 59% full. So they obviously want more to fall in those catchments. It is the end of the Easter long weekend, and tourism operators have said that, look, they've seen strong indications of people coming from interstate and staying here over the long weekend, despite the weather, despite last week's lockdown, although they are hoping when the weather does clear up over the next couple of days, that more people from interstate come to Queensland to enjoy the school holidays.
Okay, let's go back to afternoon briefing and Matt Wordsworth in Brisbane. Matt, the acting